to the real world.
Welcome, everybody. Hey, welcome to a new and very experimental style stream. Welcome to what I'm calling the situation. I have long thought that we could turn one of our techniques of community discussion, analysis of a document that is, and read through an analysis of a document that is important in a current event, but do it outside of the Geekverse. We've done that through the OGL. We've done that with different topics in the Geekverse. But there's a lot of things going on in current events too, and in the world and politics and all of that. And it's been in the back of my mind for about, I don't know, 18 months or so that maybe I could start a different kind of stream that focuses on those topics and uses that same kind of methodology for community discussion, for analysis that we've used previously on the new current event topics. And so eventually today I was like, you know what? I think I'm just going to try it. So we're doing an experimental stream here. We're testing this out, got together the graphics for it and everything like that. So I appreciate everybody who is watching. And if somebody's watching on replay or will watch on replay, I really appreciate you're here too, being here too. I was looking at, what's going on. There's certainly been a lot going on. And I've really been thinking about doing this since the last election, and there's always something going on day to day. And, it's difficult to tell what exactly is going on because, I tend to ignore headlines. I watch headlines go by on, Reddit or, Google News or, whatever other type of social media that we've got. And I tend to almost ignore it all because if it's just a headline, you see one type of headline, it's like this is going on and it's completely in one direction. And then you scroll two more inches or, 2.5 inches down and you see another headline that's basically the other way. So, what we did when it was time to do something like the OGL was actually sit down with the document and go through it and discuss it. So we read exactly what it says and try to get the context about it. We did that, even reading through doctoral dissertations about, the doctoral dissertation about open gaming licenses, and, went through that in great detail. And I think that was a very important contribution to those topics. And I think that we could do that again and contribute to current event topics as well. And I see we got Robert in the chat, and Robert does recommend the Federalist number 70. I pulled that up as well. I don't know how late we're going tonight, and I don't know what we're, I pulled up the executive order first. We're going through that. But hey, we got Charlie here as well. And this is also important. So Robert says, and here's the anti-federalist argument against the Unitary Executive, Massachusetts Centennial, 21 November 1787. Okay, I will. I don't want to miss that. So that was the other side is important too. So that's very important. Thank you very much, Robert. Like I said, I don't know how much we're going to get to today, but I feel like going through these things and figuring out what exactly they say is important, because then we can make judgment calls from there. But headlines are almost entirely useless. So, and particularly, I always think if it happens to agree with what I'm saying, or what my narrative happens to be, like, and everybody's like this. You see some type of headline that says somebody, whatever it is, did X, and if it happens to fit your narrative, then you're more inclined to agree with it. If it doesn't, then you scroll down and find the next headline that does. So, the idea here is, well, okay, what does it actually say? And we can agree or disagree from there, but at least the idea would be that we've looked at something in greater detail than a tweet or a headline or something like that. And of course, there is no shortage of stuff going on in the world today. And so this kind of document analysis, I think, is something that I think we could benefit from. So I think we should get started. And by the way, so this is a completely new channel. This is independent of the Geekverse that I've been doing. I did post about it on the Discord server, but this is kind of independent. If this goes well, please do sub to this channel. So right now, if you're interested in this kind of analysis and this kind of discussion, subbing to this new channel, the situation would be the place to get the material. But if it works well and it's something we want to continue with, then I'll come up with a separate place to put it. That's what I was working on today, and I didn't do the Geekverse live stream today, getting together the graphics and stuff today. So let's go ahead and get started here. So this right here is the first executive or the first kind of document that we're looking at. There have been a lot of different executive orders, and we could go through a lot of them. There we go. Get it straightened out here. So this one, and I think it dropped late last night. Did it not? I think it dropped late last night. And so as I was looking, like scrolling by before I went to bed last night, I saw something about some kind of new executive order. And of course, different places were couching it in different ways. This is like, one of them is definitely like extreme power grab by the, unprecedented power grab by Trump and the president and the executive. Others saw it very differently, and a return to a way that it should be, or a particular approach to the executive. So I was like, okay, well, what does it actually say? Because all the headlines. Oh, this. Did you see the executive? What do you think about the executive order where Trump did X, Y, and Z? Okay, well, first of all, does it actually say that? I mean, who knows? Oh, so I was going to put. I realized we can do that. I put together a quick poll. The theory of the unified executive is, let's see how people stand on this. We'll start the poll here. Did that go into, I think that should have gone into the chat there. The theory of the unified executive. You can start this, see what type of response we get. And then we could run the poll. If we remember, run the poll at the end as well and see how things change. So, all right. So this is ensuring accountability for all agencies. This is an executive order that was February 18th. So this was yesterday. By the authority vested in me as the president. By the authority vested in me as president by the Constitution and the laws of the United States of America, it is hereby ordered, Section 1, Policy and Purpose. The Constitution vests all executive power in the president and charges him with faithfully executing the laws. Since it would be impossible for the president to single-handedly perform all the executive business of the federal government, the Constitution also provides for subordinate officers to assist the president in his executive duties. In the exercise of their often considerable authority, these executive branch officials remain subject to the president's ongoing supervision and control. The president in turn is regularly elected by and accountable to the American people. So, I mean, this seems to be the key part here, is that of this particular document. These legislative branch officials remain subject to the president's ongoing supervision and control, and the president is in turn elected by and accountable to the American people. This is one of the structural safeguards, so says this executive order, along with the separation of powers between the executive and the legislative branches, regular elections for the Congress, and an independent judiciary whose judges are appointed by the president by and with the advice of the consent of the Senate, by which the framers created a government accountable to the American people. So, I mean, this is laying out a particular theory, of which of the understanding here. So this being a structural safeguard. So it does talk about the independent judiciary here. It talks about separation of powers between the executive and legislative branches, regular elections for Congress, independent judiciary appointed by the president with the advice and consent of the Senate. And by the way, probably if this continues, we're going to talk a lot about the role of the judiciary, because I happen to have strong opinions on the role of the legislature. I mean, we'll probably talk about the judiciary as well, but role of the legislature. If you're going to be operating a republic, and now's not the time to talk about the difference between republic or democracy or whatever, but if you're talking about Republican small r government, to me, the legislative branch is a critical component of that. And we might need to talk about, we probably will talk about potential failings of our legislative system and how that could possibly be fixed. So, but here comes the however. So here's, after laying this out, we've got, however, previous administrations have allowed so-called independent regulatory agencies, to operate with minimal presidential supervision. These regulatory agencies currently exercise substantial executive authority without sufficient accountability to the president, and through him to the American people. So it's still setting up how this runs here. Sufficient accountability to the president, and then accountability to the American people through the elected president. However, these regulatory agencies have been permitted moreover, these regulatory agencies have been permitted to promulgate significant regulations without review by the president. And I think this is an interesting point that is definitely worth getting into. Um, okay, we had the existence of regulatory agencies and their relationship to the legislature. So, what is the relationship between a regulatory agency and how can the legislature essentially delegate authority, or even delegate, perhaps delegate legislative authority, delegate the authority to create law or regulations that are treated as law to an independent, a regulatory agency. And this says these regulatory agencies have been permitted to promulgate significant regulations without review of the president. Or should that be review of the legislature? I guess that depends on, because if this is because of they're able to create regulations with the strength of law because they are created by the legislature. Wouldn't that mean you could ask the question, should that be review by the legislature? But here, this is review by the president. So I guess that's going to depend a lot on the status of the regulatory agencies, which we're going to be talking about here. So this says these practices undermine such regulatory agencies' accountability to the American people and prevent a unified and coherent execution of federal law. These practices undermine such regulatory agencies' accountability to the American people and prevent a unified and coherent execution of federal law. For the federal government to be truly accountable to the American people, officials who wield vast executive power must be supervised and controlled by the people's elected president. And of course, this is also a major discussion that is going on right here. You know, what is in the world today regarding, or at least in the United States, regarding accountability, regarding who is elected. Is being elected required? Okay, no, it's not, because we know that, you know, the president can appoint different positions such as cabinet officials with the consent of the Senate. So, okay, they're not elected, even though they can wield vast authority as well. So this is saying, if you wield vast executive authority, or if you wield executive power, what's the source of executive power? So what's the source of executive power, and does it spring from something, or does it? Is it vested? That's the word. Is it vested in anyone other than the president? Because what's the source of executive power? How are we going to get something how are we going to manifest executive power anyway? That must be from the people, right? Okay, and then who is that vested in? If it's manifest from the people, who is it vested in? Let's see. Right. Yes. So right here. And so Robert brings this up. Article 2, Section 1 is highly relevant. And I want to get to this as well. The executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States of America. Yes. So that's telling you, that's when I was using that term vested, right? That's where that comes from. Therefore, in order to improve the administration of the executive branch and to increase regulatory officials' accountability to the American people, it shall be the policy of the executive branch to ensure presidential supervision and control of the entire executive branch. Moreover, all executive departments and agencies, including so-called independent agencies, shall submit for review all proposed and final significant regulatory actions to the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, OIRA, within the executive office of the president before publication in the Federal Registrar. So this is definitely getting to what we were talking about, the theory of the unified executive. Hey, let's see how our poll was going. We've had some people here. Let's see. TSL Frontman says, similar to the Senate doing away with precedent, once they had conservative majority, the rule seems to only exist for everyone until one group has the power to literally ignore them. Bonkers. Well, and yeah, and how do we, well, see, that's something like, how do we prevent something like that constitutionally? Because, okay, if we take a look at, like when I was talking about, we have a problem with, I believe we have a problem with the legislative branch, probably a fundamental problem with the legislative branch of our government, and making sure that they stay accountable and actually do things. How do you, and are responsible, how do you force them to be? and that must be constitutional. There must be things lacking from our Constitution that could be improved upon that requires that and that forces the legislature to actually be accountable, which seems to not be there today, or which seems to not be there in our Constitution as it stands. So, okay, so shall submit, all of these departments and agencies shall submit for review all proposed and final significant regulatory actions to the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, to the Executive Office of the President before publishing in the Federal Registrar. And again, as I'm just thinking through here, okay, so this is an executive order saying, okay, this is within the executive branch. Those things must go through me, the president, because I am accountable to the people. It could go the other way. I mean, arguably, Congress, could it not take the other direction? Like this is regulatory agency has been empowered by Congress with the ability to make regulations that have the power of U.S. law. Why doesn't the Congress get to review all proposed and final significant regulatory actions to the office to the appropriate congressional authority, maybe the particular committee or something, and then to the entire office to the entire body? Why not do that? Okay. I don't know. I don't know the question to that, but I don't know the answer to that question, but that's the kind of thing that I ask. And I think it comes up a lot because I'm unclear as to the status of these agencies. So, okay, well, if the Congress makes them and puts them into the executive branch, okay, well, that does seem to imply to me that the president has authority over them. If they're created and done something else, then maybe not. And it also seems to me, like as I was sitting here thinking about something like the EPA or something, you've got two different parts of the EPA, right? You've got the part that creates regulation, and then you also have their enforcement, right? They can enforce it as well, which does seem like it's doing both roles. Introduction of regulation, which is a lot like legislation, creation of law, and then also the enforcement of that law. Does it make sense that those things are together? Should those things be different? Should the regulation, if you're going to have an independent body like the EPA, that Congress has delegated its authority to create environmental regulations with, should it not be the one who revises or and approves all of the regulation, while the enforcement of those, that seems like a more executive thing? I've never thought about this in this level of detail, so this is very much off the top of my head here as I've been reading through all of this and going through this. Because also, it's not really something that's taught. When you think about the branches of government, you talk about the legislative, you talk about the judiciary, and you talk about the executive. Certainly, high school government class, and I'm I'm very critical of our education system, but when you think about, I don't remember ever learning about, okay, the legal status of independent agencies in something like U.S. government class. So this is probably not a subject that most Americans are familiar with at all, right? And really have an understanding of where these things fit. Robert is bringing up, so Section 3, this is Article 2, Section 3 of the U.S. Constitution. He shall take care, he being the president, shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed and shall commission all the officers of the United States. And then also Section 2 here, he may require the opinion in writing of the principal officers in each of the executive departments upon any subject relating to the duties of their respective offices. So, okay, for the purposes of this order, the term employees shall have the meaning given that term in Section 2105 of Title V United States Code. I was particularly interested in this. I said Section B here, or subsection B, or whatever, Section 2B, the term independent regulatory agency. I was very interested in that definition. Okay, so what does that mean? The term independent regulatory agency shall have the meaning given to that term in Section 3502, Section 5 of Title 44 United States Code. I was like, well, okay, so what is that definition? And unfortunately, I was a bit disappointed with this definition. The method used to define independent regulatory agency is basically a list. Now, this is one of the ways that you can define a term, is by saying Here's the list of things that I mean by that term, rather than giving, for instance, necessary and sufficient conditions for something to be an independent regulatory agency. That would be like defining the planets as the list of 9 planets from Mercury out to Pluto. Instead of giving something that, okay, here's what it actually means to be a planet, necessary and sufficient conditions. When you find something else, you can evaluate it against this definition to determine whether it is or is not. This particular part of the U.S. Code defines independent regulatory agencies basically as a big list. The term independent regulatory agency, which is being referred to in this executive order, means the board of governors of the Federal Reserve System, the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, the Consumer Product Safety Commission, the Federal Communications Commission, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the Federal Energy Regulation Commission, the Federal Housing Agency, the Federal Marine Commission, the Federal Trade Commission, the Interstate Commerce Commission, the Mine Enforcement Safety and Health Review Commission, the National Labor Relations Board, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the Occupational Safety and Health Review Commission, the Postal Regulatory Commission, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Bureau of Consumer Financial Protection, the Office of Financial Research, the Office of Comptroller of the Currency, and any other similar agency designated by statute as a federal independent regulatory agency or commission. So it's a list plus anything similar designated as such. Okay, so that's the kind of definition that we're working with here. Let's see. So that's what the term independent regulatory agency means, that we just read, according to that section of the United States Code. This order shall not apply to the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System or to the Federal Open Market Committee in its conduct of monetary policy. This order shall apply to the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System only in connection with its conduct and authorities directly related to its supervision and regulation of financial institutions. The term independent regulatory agency chairman shall mean, with regard to a multi-member independent regulatory agency, the chairman of such agency, and shall mean, with regard to a single-headed independent regulatory agency, such agency's chairman, director, or other presiding officer. The term head of an independent regulatory agency shall mean those appointed to supervise independent regulatory agencies and in whom the agency's authorities are generally vested, encompassing the chairman, director, or other presiding officer, as applicable, other members, commissioners, or similar such officials with responsibility for supervising such agencies. Section 3, the OIRA review of agency regulations. This is what everyone is supposed to report the proposed and final versions of. Section 3B of Executive Order 12866 of September 30th, 1993, Regulatory Planning and Review, as amended, is hereby amended to read as follows. Okay, so agency, unless otherwise indicated, means any authority of the United States that is an agency under U.S. Code 30521, and shall also include the Federal Election Commission. So people do talk about that. So here we have agency, including the Federal Election Commission. This shall not apply to the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System or to the Federal Open Market Committee in its conduct of monetary policy. This order shall apply to the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System only in connection with its conduct and authorities directly related to its supervision and regulation of financial institutions. So this is regarding the OIRA. All executive departments and agencies, that's why it's defining this as an agency. So all executive departments and agencies, including the so-called independent agencies, that's why it's giving you definitions of this, shall submit for review all proposed and final significant regulatory actions to the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. And agency is specifically defined here as including the Federal Election Commission. The Director of the Office of Management and Budget shall provide guidance on implementation of this order to the heads of executive departments and agencies newly submitting regulatory actions under Section 3B of Executive Order 12866. I don't really know anything about this. Let's see if I should be able to just find that quickly, right? National Archive sounds pretty good. So this is from 1993. Let's just look at the beginning here. The American people deserve a regulatory system that works for them, not against them. A regulatory system that provides and promotes and improves, protects and improves their health, safety, environment, and well being, and improves the performance of the economy without imposing unacceptable or unreasonable costs on society. Regulatory policies that recognize that the private sector and private markets are the best engine for economic growth. Regulatory approaches that respect the role of state, local, and tribal governments, and regulations that are effective, consistent, sensible, and understandable. We do not have such a regulatory system today. With this executive order, the federal government begins a program to reform and make more efficient the regulatory process. The objectives of this order are to enhance planning and coordination with respect to both new and existing regulations. So this is something that has been done before to reaffirm the primacy of federal agencies in the regulatory decision-making process, to restore the integrity and legitimacy of regulatory review and oversight, and to make the process more accessible and open to the public. In pursuing these objectives, the regulatory process shall be conducted so as to meet applicable statutory requirements with due regard to the discretion that has been trusted to the federal agencies. So, that's our preamble. How does hold on, I kind of actually want to go through this. Hey Titterpig Rancher, welcome, welcome. Titterpig says it's inherent in the office of an executive, regardless of scale, whether national or corporate or anything else, to have authority to dictate the operations and officers of the organization. The president is in essence the king of the United States. Well, I don't know about that. The difference is he does not have the power to draft and enact laws, only to enforce them. And in my opinion, the executive orders have been highly overused since the Obama administration. Well, the how many executive orders have been signed in this Trump administration so far? I mean, it's a lot, right? There's a lot to go over. We could have been going over them in the uh, maybe we should have been, but well, I forget where I was going with that. Oh, but this, I think this is symptomatic. I think to me, this is another symptom of a legislature that is not completely functional. Because if we govern by these executive orders, even if you don't like executive orders, okay, what's the first thing that an incoming president does if he's of the opposite party than the outgoing president? Well, start to repeal a bunch of sign executive orders, repealing a bunch of executive orders. So these things can flip flop on potentially a 4-year basis. That doesn't promote stability of government, in my opinion. This would be much better done through a functioning legislature. You would end up with more durable laws, and you would theoretically, if you have a functioning legislature, have all of your accountability more directly to the people, being that you have a Senate and a House of Representatives, and the House turns over every 2 years. But nonetheless, I think that it's a symptom of a dysfunctional legislature that you end up with a lot of executive orders. And that has come up before, that in the materials I had been reading before, like what happens in the event of national emergency, what happens when you have a inefficient or dysfunctional legislature. Chances are, it seemed to be, that you're going to end up with an increasingly king-like, let's say, that presidency, that the president is going to step into this void that is not that's been given up by the legislature. So this does seem like an interesting one here, because this is what's being amended. So the reason we got over here is that provide guidance on the implementation, submitting regulatory actions under Section 3B. Let's go down to Section 3B. So let's go Section 3B. If you're submitting regulatory action, where is 3? Where would that be? think I skipped it. This seems to be section 2. Let me see if I can just find section 3. Section 3B. No, that doesn't sound right. Maybe that's should be section. No, that is, yeah, section 1. Okay, so you already had to submit regulation through. It's interesting to me that you're submitting the regulation through this particular part of an executive order. Agency submission by independent regulatory agencies under a section shall commence within the earlier of 60 days from the date of this order or the completion of such implementation guidance. Oh, really? So FDR says or Titter Pig Rancher says FDR was the most executive order happy president in history. Hit over 3,000, I think 3,700 or so. Yeah, actually, I was talking to a friend about co-consuls as presidents just not long ago. Yes, and so he came in. So we have the new the amendment to limit the president to 2 terms. Didn't the office spoof that with like the popes? Yes, and that's also our thought about Rome today. Section 3B. Section 2, Section 3. I mean, all I see is this: agency, unless otherwise indicated, means any authority of the United States that is an agency under, and that's going back to the same part of section, the U.S. Code, to be an independent regulatory agencies. This must provide like a procedure. Didn't I see something about like procedure in here? Let's see, regulatory philosophy. So let's see that. Federal agencies should promulgate only such regulations as are required by law, are necessary to interpret the law, or made necessary by compelling public need, such as material failures of private markets to protect or improve the health and safety of the public, the environment, or the well-being of the American people. In deciding whether or how to regulate, agencies should assess all costs and benefits of available regulatory alternatives, including the alternatives of not regulating. In deciding whether or not or how to regulate, agencies should assess all costs and benefits of available regulatory alternatives, including the alternative of not regulating. Costs and benefits should be understood to include both quantifiable measures to the fullest extent that those can be fully estimated, and qualitative measures of costs and benefits that are difficult to quantify, but nonetheless essential to consider. Further, in choosing among alternative regulatory approaches, agencies should select those approaches that maximize net benefits, potential economic, public safety, etc. Adhere to the following principles. Each agency shall identify the problem that it intends to address, including where applicable, the failures of private markets or public institutions that warrant new agency action, as well as assess the significance of that problem. Each agency shall examine whether existing regulations or other law have created or contributed to the problem that the new legislation is intended to correct, and whether those regulations or other law should be modified to achieve the intended goal of regulation more efficiently. So that's not exactly what I was looking for. It sounds like shall provide guidance on implementation of this order to the heads of executive departments that would otherwise have been submitting under this other executive order. That was like from 1993. So section 4, performance standards and management objectives. This is back to the one that was just currently signed. The director of OMB shall establish performance standards and management objectives for independent agency heads as appropriate and consistent with applicable law, and report periodically to the president of their performance and efficiency in attaining such standards and objectives. Apportionments for independent regulatory agencies. The director of OMB shall, on an ongoing basis, review independent regulatory actions obligations for consistency with the president's policies and priorities. Okay, so that's a new one, right? Review independent regulatory agencies' obligations for consistency with the president's policies and priorities. And B, consult with independent regulatory agency chairmen and adjust such agencies' apportionments by activity, function, project, or object as necessary and appropriate to advance the president's policies and priorities. Such adjustments to apportionments may prohibit independent regulatory agencies from expending appropriations on particular activities, functions, or projects or objects, so long as such restrictions are consistent with law. Okay, so that is, so presumably as apportioned by Congress, right? Adjust such agencies' apportionments, taking that by funding, by activity, function, project, or object as necessary and appropriate to advance the president's policies and priorities. Such adjustment of apportionment may prohibit an independent regulatory agency from expending appropriations on particular activities so long as the restrictions are consistent with law, presumably what Congress has established. Section 6, additional consultation with the executive office of the president. Subject to subsection 6b, independent regulatory agency chairman shall regularly consult with and coordinate with policies and priorities with the director of OMB, the White House Domestic Policy Council, and the White House National Economic Council. The heads of independent regulatory agencies shall establish a position of White House liaison. Okay, so this is also new, right? The heads of the independent regulatory agencies shall establish a position of White House liaison in their respective agencies. Such position shall be in grade 15 of the general schedule and be placed in Schedule C of the expected service. So this White House liaison officer is supposed to be acting, I'm guessing, as the go-between between the agency and the offices of the president or the ones that he has, or his designees, to ensure that what their regulatory action is doing is in fit with his policies. Independent regulatory agency chairman shall submit agency strategic plans developed pursuant to the Government Performance and Results Act of 1993 to the director of the OMB for clearance prior to finalization. This is also a big one. Section 7, rules of conduct guiding federal employees' interpretation of the law. The president and the attorney general, subject to the president's supervision and control, shall provide authoritative interpretations of the law for the executive branch. And I've been seeing this talked about quite a bit too online. That what does this mean to interpret law? Because the interpretation of law, that's the judiciary branch, right? Traditionally, that is the role of the judiciary. So people have been asking, does this mean that we are looking at a situation where the executive branch is cutting out the, I guess, judicial oversight or the check and balance of the judiciary, because the president and the attorney general shall now provide authoritative interpretations of law, but it does say for the executive branch. The president and the attorney general's opinion on questions of law are controlling on all employees in the conduct of their official duties. No employee of the executive branch acting in their official capacity may advance an interpretation of the law as the position of the United States that contravenes the president or the attorney general's opinion on a matter of law, including but not limited to the issuance of regulations, guidance, and positions advanced in litigation, unless authorized to do so by the president in writing or the attorney general. I do wish that this was more clear with regard to the role of the judiciary here, because I can see, okay, that for the functioning of the executive branch, you're going to have to interpret law as a practical matter. In fact, it reminds me of like the Southern Baptists who say, well, I don't interpret the Bible, I just apply it. I just read it and apply it. So there can be that approach to federal legislation. And of course, arguably on a fundamental level, there should be. Like, okay, I don't interpret federal law. I just read it and I apply it. That's what happens. I just read the law and I apply it. And then in the event that there needs to be some type of interpretation of the law, well, that is what the judiciary is for. That I have applied it in an incorrect way. I have applied it in a way that is inconsistent with the way it should be applied, or whether or not the intention of the legislature matters, and so forth when you discuss those things. But okay, maybe that's what the executive should be doing. Well, we received legislation from the Congress and we applied it. In the event that our application of that law is in error, the judiciary will correct it. But in practice, I can see that, well, any type of application is going to be some kind of interpretation. I mean, is it not? As a practical matter, if you, especially as complicated as federal law is, with overlapping regulation and such, a more favorable interpretation of this to the executive branch would be saying, well, we are just talking about how we are going to be applying the law as the executive branch. The president and ultimately the president and the attorney general only through the supervision and control of the president provides the authoritative interpretations of the law for the executive branch, and that all of the agencies shall be that operating under the purview of the president shall adhere to that interpretation. And I would hope that the idea here is, unless directed otherwise, such as by judiciary review, right? We got the interpretation wrong. I guess we will see, right? Section 8, general provisions. If any provision of this order or the application of any provision to any person or circumstance is held to be invalid, the remainder of this order and the application of its provision to any other person or circumstances shall not be affected thereby. Nothing in this order shall be construed to impair or otherwise affect the authority granted by law to an executive department, agency, or the head thereof, the functions of the director of the Office of Management and Budget relating to budgetary administration and legislative proposals. This order shall be implemented consistent with the applicable law and subject to the availability of appropriations. This order is not intended to and does not create any right or benefit, substantive or procedural, enforceable at law or in equity by any party against the United States, its departments, agencies, or entities, its officers, employees, agents, or any other person. Titterpig says the purpose of the judiciary is to stand as guardians of the constitutional law and to make sure that all legislation accords with it. So, a lot of this, to me, has to do with the status of independent agencies and its legal ability. Like, I was looking here, so Wikipedia provides a list of this, independent agencies of the United States government. This says right here, established through separate statutes passed by Congress. Each respective statutory grant of authority defines the goal of the agency must work towards, as well as what substantive areas, if any, over which it may have the power of rulemaking. These agency rules or regulations, when enforced, have the power of federal law. And I was looking down here because it did have a list of examples of independent agencies. So like Amtrak is one. National Railroad Passenger Corporation. This is a passenger railroad service that provides okay, we know what it is, but Amtrak, okay, is one. Like, okay, and I guess I never exactly thought about that before. So what is the relationship of Amtrak to the rest of our government? Because on a fundamental level, or on a basic level, when you just look at this, you go, okay, what does our government have? Legislative, executive, and judiciary branches. How do I establish something that is outside of that? And I was trying to look that up, and I was actually experimenting with something like the AI research. The AI research new applications and such to try, but I only got to experiment with that a little bit before this stream. So I want to do that some more because I was asking that, okay, what type of authority, constitutional or legal, and can you provide sources about what is the status of something that is not part of either one of those three? Now, I didn't know this. Now, of course, I knew the Central Intelligence Agency was not part of the Department of Defense, but the Central Intelligence Agency is one of these independent agencies. The Chemical Safety and Hazards Investigation Board, Commodity Futures Trading Commission, Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, Consumer Product Safety Commission, Election Assistance Commission, Environmental Protection Agency, Export-Import Bank of the United States, Federal Communications Commission, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. I mean, a lot of these I've heard of. A lot of people have heard of. A lot of them I have not. Federal Elections Commission, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, Federal Housing Finance Agency, Federal Maritime Commission, Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service, the Federal Reserve System, the Federal Retirement Thrift Investment Board, Federal Trade Commission, General Service Administration, the International Trade Commission, National Aeronautics and Space Administration. NASA is one of those. I wanted to work for NASA for a long time as a kid. So NASA is one of these. National Archives and Records Administration, National Credit Union, National Labor Relations Board, National Science Foundation is one, National Transportation Security Board, Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the Office of Special Counsel. This is a permanent investigative and prosecutorial agency that operates a secure channel for federal whistleblower disclosures, protects federal employees from reprisal when whistleblowing, and enforces the restrictions of the Hatch Act on partisan political activity by government employees. The Peace Corps is, according to Wikipedia here, the Postal Regulatory Commission, Securities and Exchange Commission, Selective Service System, Small Business Administration, the Social Security Administration, Surface Transportation Board, the Tennessee Valley Authority, United States Agency for International Development. Okay, that one's been in the news quite a bit, right? The USAID. United States Office of Personnel Management, the United States Postal Service, the United States Trade and Development Agency. So, I mean, there are a lot of these things. I mean, that exist in this, and like I said, this is not something that I have gone deep into, and I don't think it's something that many of us go deep into, because this is something that is outside of what we consider our three branches of government. So their relationship between the different branches of government and these agencies. I mean, this is an important discussion, right? So we've got, well, of course, okay, so Titter Pigs, I was saying, technically anything outside that is supposed to revert to the states and not have a new federal body instituted to support it. Like, I'm interested to know, like, it seems like something to read and to analyze the legal theory behind, okay, we're going to create something that's not in any of those three positions. Because I can see creating, like, okay, if we're going to have the legislature be able to delegate its authority to create regulations, then that body that creates those regulations seems like it should be under the legislature. And if you have a body that is supposed to enforce those regulations, that one seems like it's going to be under the executive. But what do you do when you have something like, okay, the EPA, which is seemingly like it's doing both, and yet it exists outside of that? That's not something I've really thought about that much before. So the line that's being, or the thing that's being thrown around quite a bit here is the theory of the unitary executive. Unitary executive theory. Okay, we've got the neutrality flag here. And I do have something that was up from Reuters that was published here. This was actually February 14th. Unitary executive theory may reach Supreme Court as Trump wields sweeping power. So this is, in American law, the unitary executive theory is a constitutional law theory according to which the President of the United States has sole authority over the executive branch. It is an expansive interpretation of presidential power that aims to centralize greater control over the government of the White House. Uh, Government in the White House. And this does bring up what we were talking about. Let's see, terminology theory, the vesting clause. Um, the unitary executive theory has sparked significant debate as to what the Constitution says about presidential power. The theory is often advanced by proponents in debates arguing for more presidential power when it comes to hiring and firing members of the executive branch, including historically independent administrative law judges, prosecutors like special counsels, and inspectors general. Okay, that's also an interesting point too, and it's actually um, something like an inspector general like of a particular agency is expected to operate with some independence um, of the agency in order to fulfill its role, in detecting problems or crimes or fraud or whatever it's doing. And this may end up being a weakness of the constitutional system. We don't really have that specified, right? Uh, and we're going to talk more about that probably if we continue with this with the executive. But I see that kind of as a weakness here because, okay, if you have a very unified executive, then something like the presence of an inspector general that is supposed to operate with some kind of independence may not exist, right? And maybe it should exist. There's what the Constitution allows, what the law says, and then what perhaps it should be, or what we could come up with a better way to do this. Robert says the legislature delegates rulemaking to the executive overseen by the president. That's the constitutional scheme. Anything beyond that is likely unconstitutional. Uh, so, yeah, so that's the way it seemed to go. Yeah, when we were looking at these executive orders, that, okay, the legislature delegates this authority to this agency, and then those go through the executive. I mean, which does seem kind of weird to me on first glance. Who knows? We will see. We can always change our minds here as we are reading through here, but I had never thought about that before. But yes, the vesting clause. This is the important one right here. The vesting clause of Article 2, perhaps the most cited clause in favor of a stronger executive, reads, "The executive power of the United States shall be vested in the President of the United States of America." Some have suggested that interpreting the vesting clause is difficult and may have simply been an attempt by the founders to reject the idea of an executive council, which was widely discussed at the time, rather than advocating a strong executive. We were just talking about that with like co-consuls or something like that. But on the other hand, Jed Handelson Sugarman looks at the context of how the word vest was used before the Constitution, finding that it may signify significantly less completeness of the power than it seems today. Okay, that's interesting to read too. Other scholars maintain the vesting clause is clear, and that at minimum, the vesting clause establishes an executive office to be occupied by an individual. In 2020, the Supreme Court ruled 4-5 that under the vesting clause, the entire executive power belongs to the president alone. In the 2020s, the Supreme Court, in the 2020s, the Supreme Court held that regarding the powers granted by the vesting clause, the entire executive power belongs to the president alone. I mean, on first blush, that's the way that I would read it. That it seems if executive power is allowed to be exercised in the United States, that power is vested in the president of the United States, and other people may exercise that power basically as a deputy of the president, the cabinet officials and so forth, and there are ways to appoint those people. That it seems difficult by that. Now, this is Sugarman may have something else, may have a valid argument here. What is this? Vesting, Stanford Law Review. That would also be something very interesting to go through right there. But at the moment, yes, with my understanding of vesting, I would have a difficult time coming up with a way that is a separate source of executive power than through the president. It would be the people vesting executive power in the president, and I would have a difficult time coming up with a separate source of executive power. That's the way I would read that. Proponents of the unitary executive theory additionally argue that the take care clause, the president shall take care the laws be faithfully executed, creates a hierarchical, unified executive department under the direct control of the president. Critics point out that this clause does not specify that the president should be the one to execute the laws, but to make sure that others are faithfully executing their responsibilities. Critics also point out to faithfully executed point to faithfully executed as meaning to follow court rulings and legislative statutes, regardless of whether a president agrees with them. Well, I would also, I mean, I would agree with that, that whether or not the president agrees with a particular, like, for instance, law, that's not, at, that's not under consideration. Opponents of this theory point to the opinion clause, which says only that a president may ask for the opinion in writing of a department officer about any subject related to their department, which seems superfluous if the president was supposed to have extensive power. Let's read this on the King of Great Britain. Then I want to go over to what Reuters is saying over here. Proponents have made claims about the powers wielded by the King of Great Britain, often inaccurately referred to in this context as the King of England, at the time of the founding and their relationship to the founding intent of the executive branch to justify the theory. The actual powers held by the Crown are disputed by legal historians as conventional wisdoms, as Parliament held significant power over appointments and dismissals of some executive personnel, while others served for life and were independent of the king. Law professor Daniel Burke argues there's no evidence that the king had such powers outside specific areas like foreign policy and the military, saying the king could not direct most law enforcement, regulatory, or administrative officials. Invoking the king as an argument for expanded executive power was first made by the Supreme Court in Myers v. United States in 1926, a decision delivered by Chief Justice William Howard Taft, a former president of the United States. Eric Nelson argued that some founders wanted more checks on a president because, unlike a hereditary monarch, their well-being was not as intrinsically tied to the nation. Okay, let's go over here and see what this, so this is, we can actually get to this. Oh, well, that's nice. So the vesting article, maybe we don't go into this right now, but I was able to pull that up directly. This article offers a close textual reading of the word vesting and an examination of its 18th century usage and context, with the first survey of available dictionaries from 1637 to 1846, colonial charters of state constitutions, the Constitutional Convention, and ratification debates. Dictionaries define vest in terms of basic landed property rights without reference to exclusivity or indefensibility or indefeasibility, and rarely with any reference to office or powers. Other legal documents and digital collections of the founders' papers indicate a range of uses, from fully vested to simply vested to partly vested, so the word vesting itself would signify less completeness. Meanwhile, words used in the Constitution or by the framers to convey exclusivity or indefeasibility, for example, all, exclusive, sole, alone, and indefeasible, are missing from the executive vesting clause. The ordinary meaning of vesting was more likely a simple grant of powers without signifying the impermissibility of legislative conditions, such as good cause requirements for removals, undermining the unitary theory's originalist basis. On the other hand, the all in the legislative vesting clause may be more legally meaningful for non-delegation. Oh, that's something else I want to talk about, the non-delegation ideas here. I had this brought up as well. So that's very interesting. We've got two different, I think I have the Constitution here. So it says here, so let's look at the difference. Oh, right here. So right here, Article 1, all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in the Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a Senate and the House of Representatives. So he's saying that we've got all right here. And then if I go down to section or Article 2, the executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States of America. And so he's saying, how do we interpret the difference? I mean, that's an interesting question. Hey, Bacon, good to see you. That's an interesting question. So Section 2 or Article 2 says the executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States of America. To me, yes, on first reading, that does seem rather definitive. Okay, but Sugarman wants us to contrast that with Section 1, all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States, which shall consist of Senate and House of Representatives. It is interesting that they use different terminology there. That is interesting. It's but it also but it's also different in the sense that this says all legislative powers herein granted. What does that seem to imply to me upon reading? Well, it seems to me that there are legislative powers that are not vested in Congress. And well, of course, that seems to make sense because there are legislative powers that that could exist. There are legislative powers that exist that we could acknowledge that exist, except for they are not vested in Congress. So this is saying all legislative powers herein granted. I think it would be different. To me, it would be different if it said all legislative powers shall be vested in a Congress of the United States. All legislative powers shall be vested in a Congress of the United States. And then that would be more like all executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States of America. That would be much more parallel. I mean, it's interesting that these are not parallel. So, I mean, that's an interesting point. What is the difference, if any, between those two non-parallel vestings of the legislature and the president? Here, let's see what it says with Article 3. Article 3, trying to increase. Article 3 says the judicial power of the United States shall be vested in one Supreme Court and in such inferior courts as the Congress may from time to time ordain and establish. The judges, both of the Supreme and Inferior Court, shall hold their offices during good behavior and shall, at times stated, receive for their services a compensation which shall not be diminished during their continuance in office. So the judicial power of the United States shall be vested in one Supreme Court and in such inferior courts as the Congress may from time to time ordain and establish. It is interesting to me that these things are written in three different ways. This is much more like the Article 2, right? The executive power, the judicial power shall be vested in, yes, the Supreme Court of the United States of America, in one Supreme Court, and in such inferior courts as the Congress may from time to time ordain and establish. Of course, now as I'm reading this, it's interesting that who gets to decide what inferior courts need to be established? It's the Congress. The Congress decides what inferior courts need to be established, not the Supreme Court. I've never really thought about that either. That if the judiciary power is vested in the Supreme Court, it doesn't say that the Supreme Court may decide to establish inferior courts as it sees fit and it does require. And you might think that well, gee, okay, the judicial power will be vested in the Supreme Court, and if it decides there needs to be inferior courts throughout the realm that are, subservient to it, then that's the Supreme Court's purview. But it's not. It is the Congress's purview, and that seems to suggest that this is vested simultaneously, unlike what we just saw with the executive. The inferior courts the Congress may from time to time ordain and establish seem to have their judicial power vested in them directly by the Constitution. What are you thinking about this? Whereas up here, the officers of the United States, let's see. How do officers of the United States receive their executive authority? It seems like through the president. This is electors' qualifications. Well, I guess down here, right? He shall have the power by and with the advice and consent of the Senate to make treaties, provided 2/3 of the senators present occur, and he shall nominate, and by and with the advice and consent of the Senate, shall appoint ambassadors, other public ministers and consuls, judges of the Supreme Court, and all other officers of the United States whose appointments are not herein specifically provided for, and which shall be established by law, but the Congress may by law vest each appointment of such inferior offices as they think proper in the president alone, in the court of law, or in the heads of the department. Okay, so that's not entirely clear right here, because the Congress may by law vest, so that the Congress gets to vest the appointments of such inferior officers as they think proper in the president alone, in the courts of law, or in the heads of the department. So it's not clear. Section 3, is that what I was just reading? Oh, down here? Let's see. Yeah, Congress decides inferior courts. Titterpig says that's why all powers not specifically stated in the Constitution would revert to the states. Yeah, I think that has to do with all legislative authority herein declared. I need to look at Section 3 right here. Article 3, Section Article 2, Section 3. So he shall from time to time give to Congress, this is about the president, information of the state of the Union, and recommend their consideration such measures as he shall judge necessary and expedient. He may, on extraordinary occasions, convene both houses, or either of them, and in case of disagreement between them with respect to the time of adjournment, and may adjourn them to such time as he thinks proper. He shall receive ambassadors and other public ministers. He shall take care the laws be faithfully executed, and shall commission all officers of the United States. Okay, that's it right there. Yeah. So he shall take care the laws be faithfully executed. Yeah, we read that before. So that is it. So the president commissions all officers of the United States, which seems to me to be that you are acting with executive authority only by virtue of being commissioned by the president. If you are an officer of the United States, you must be commissioned by the president, and that is the source of your executive authority. Officer vested by the president, who has been vested by the people. That would be my understanding. Okay, let's go over here and see. Well, I mean, this is an interesting point too. So we brought up this idea of non-delegation doctrine, because actually that was hit over here. On the other hand, this is probably a very interesting article here. On the other hand, the all in the legislative vesting clause may be more legally meaningful for non-delegation. Okay, so actually non-delegation is something I was looking at independently of that. So it's interesting that it came up. Let's go over here. Non-delegation doctrine. The doctrine of non-delegation or non-delegation principle is the theory that one branch of government must not authorize another entity to exercise the power or function with which it is constitutionally authorized to express itself. It is explicit or implicit in all written constitutions that impose a strict structural separation of powers. It's usually applied in question to the constitutionally improper delegations of powers of any of the three branches of government to either of the other, or to the administrative state, or to private entities. Although it's usually constitutional for executive officials to delegate executive powers to executive branch subordinates, there can also be improper delegations of power within an executive branch. So let's see what it says about the United States. It says, in the federal government of the United States, the non-delegation doctrine is the theory that the Congress of the United States, being vested with all legislative powers by Article 1, Section 1 of the United States Constitution, cannot delegate power to anyone else. So this would be at the core of something like the creation of a regulatory agency. I suppose whether or not it is independent of any other branch of government or not. But we have, can the United States Congress delegate its legislative authority. The scope of this restriction has been the subject of a dispute. The Supreme Court ruled in J.W. Hampton Jr. and Company versus United States in 1928 that congressional delegation of legislative authority is an implied power of Congress that is constitutional so long as Congress provides an intelligible principle to guide the executive branch. So that's, again, that we were just talking about that. I think Robert was just talking about. We need an intelligible principle to guide the executive branch in doing this. So this is a delegation of authority, legislative authority, an implied power of Congress to the executive branch. In determining what Congress may do in seeking assistance from another branch, the extent and character of that assistance, must be fixed according to common sense. Okay, boy, that's good. You got to fix this according to common sense and the inherent necessities of the government coordination. So long as Congress shall lay down by legislative act an intelligible principle to which the person or body authorized exercise the delegated authority is directed to conform, such legislative action is not forbidden delegation of legislative power. So Posner and Vermeule in 2002 further argued the restriction is only that the legislature cannot delegate the authority to vote on legislation or execute other de jure powers of the legislature. Further, they argue the grant of power to the executive branch is never a transfer of legislative power, but an exercise of legislative powers. I guess that's what exactly Robert is talking about here. McCulloch versus Maryland addressed this. Does Congress have to mint the coins, or can it create a mint, a treasury, a bank? Court said Congress created laws saying the executive branch needed to mint the coins. Well, thank you, Bacon. I thought so. So in what's happening here in that case would be that we're not transferring legislative power to the executive, but we are offering the executive the exercise of legislative power. So, for example, the Food and Drug Administration is an agency in the executive branch created by Congress. So the Food and Drug Administration, this says it's in the executive branch. So that's not an independent agency. So we didn't see Food and Drug on that list. This says, according to Wikipedia, that this is an agency in the executive branch created by Congress with the power to regulate food and drugs in the United States. Congress has given the FDA a broad mandate to ensure the safety of the public and prevent false advertising, but it's up to the agency to assess risks and announce prohibitions on harmful additives and to determine the process by which actions will be brought based on the same. So that's okay. So that's up to the agency to determine what is prohibited and harmful, and then also determine the process by which action will be taken on that. Similarly, the Internal Revenue Service has been given the responsibility of collecting taxes that are assessed under the Internal Revenue Code. Although Congress has determined the amount of tax to be assessed, it has delegated the IRS the authority to determine how such taxes are to be collected. The non-delegation doctrine has been used in such cases to argue against the constitutionality of expanding bureaucratic power. Some scholars argue the non-delegation doctrine has proven popular in state courts, but with two exceptions in 1935, legal scholars assume the doctrine is not evident in federal courts. This trend began to reverse due to the views of Chief Justice John Roberts, citation needed, who joined Justice Gorsuch's dissenting opinion in Gundy versus United States. In Gundy, the court upheld a provision of the Sex Offenders Registration and Notification Act, authorizing the Attorney General to prescribe rules concerning offenders who would have to register as sex offenders. However, Gorsuch argued the statutory provision violated the non-delegation doctrine because it was not one of three exceptions to the non-delegation doctrine. Or the statutory provision violated this because it was not one of three. I thought this was really interesting. I liked what Locke said right here. Let's take a look at this. This is early ideas on the delegation doctrine. Let's see. McCulloch was cited the necessary and proper to bring into execution the foregoing powers clause. Who does the execution? The president. So Congress can't determine the president isn't responsible for executing certain laws. Think about that. So, okay, I thought the origins of the non-delegation doctrine as interpreted in the U.S. can be traced back at least to 1690 when John Locke wrote, The legislative cannot transfer the power of making laws to any other hands, for it being but a delegated power to the people, from the people, for it being but a delegated power from the people, they who have it cannot pass it over to others. And when the people have said, we will submit to rules and be governed by laws made by such men and in such forms, nobody else can say other men shall make laws for them, nor can the people be bound by any laws but such as are enacted by those who have chosen and authorized to make laws for them. The power of the legislative, being derived from the people by a positive voluntary grant and institution, can be no other than what the positive grant conveyed, which being only to make laws and not to make legislatures. The legislature can have no power to transfer their authority of making laws and place it into other hands. I kind of like that. I think I like that. I think in this case, go Locke, right? I like that. So that's where that comes from. Very early, it, I mean, 1690s. You know, I often say that when we are talking about like understanding people of the past, which we've talked about like on Table Talk, like what does it mean to what is it like? What was it like to have been an ancient Roman or an ancient Egyptian or Byzantine when Doug is talking about his, writing his book and so forth? It's kind of difficult to get into that mindset. Like what is that mindset? I think it's less difficult to get into the mindset of somebody by the 17th century. There's a lot. I think we could have a conversation with somebody from the 17th century, certainly 18th century. I mean, yeah, if they were here, they'd see electricity and other things. But I think we would definitely have, from if you're talking to someone from the West, a sufficiently common understanding of our foundations that we would able to be intelligible to one another and understand each other. So, I mean, I think this is a great example right here. Locke is talking about something very fundamental here. Um, we'll see, one of the earliest cases involving the exact limits of non-delegation was Wayman versus Southard in 1825. Congress had delegated to the courts the power to prescribe judicial procedure. It was contended that Congress had thereby unconstitutionally clothed the judiciary and legislative powers. While Chief Justice John Marshall conceded that the determination of rules of procedure was a legislative function, he distinguished between important subjects and mere details. Marshall wrote that a general provision may be made with power given to those who are able to act under such general provisions to fill up the details. In 1892, the court in Field versus Clark, 146 U.S. 649, noted that Congress cannot delegate legislative power to the president, is a principle universally recognized as vital to the integrity and maintenance of the system of government ordained by the Constitution, while holding the tariff-setting authority delegated in the McKinley Act was not the making of law, but rather empowered the legislative branch to serve as a mere agent of Congress. So that's so a difference of details. Okay, yeah, I mean, it seems like that's true. Congress cannot delegate legislative power to the president, but it sure can do a lot, and it certainly gives up a lot of its power and authority. And according to this, the tariff setting authority is not the making of laws. Okay, well, actually, if that's important to setting tariffs, we sure are having a lot of that right now as well, right? Who is able to set authority? So tariffs. This is saying that's empowering the executive branch to serve as a agent of Congress. Could that be one of our acts that allows the president to do that? I'm not sure if I mean, tariffs are certainly a big thing right now. Maybe that's not something we need to get into right there, but that's an interesting question right there. Here's what's being talked about right now. So this was in Reuters just a couple of days ago. We'll go with this and then we'll see here. Titterpig says it takes some serious leaps of logic to try to pretend what Locke just states right there wasn't the intent behind nearly everything the framers of the Constitution put into it. I mean, I'm big. If you're going to have a government, then and you're going to have a republic, then a strong legislature is so important. Thomas Jefferson's administration ran under budget and was funded by tariffs. But I wonder how they were. But I wonder how they were. Certainly today we've got seems like the president is in charge of raising tariffs. Let's see. So like here. So Washington, February 14th, Reuters writes, Donald Trump's broad assertions of power appear to be advancing an aggressive version of a legal doctrine called the Unitary Executive theory that envisions vast executive authority for a president, setting up a potential U.S. Supreme Court showdowns. The conservatives' theory advocates argue that Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution, which delineates presidential powers, gives the president sole authority over the government's executive branch. It envisions robust powers even when the Congress has sought to impose certain limits, such as restricting a president's ability to fire the heads of some independent agencies. The Supreme Court is expected to be called upon to review at least one key legal dispute over the Republican president's contentious actions implicating this doctrine, with numerous legal challenges already moving through lower courts. Trump's firing of a member of the National Labor Relations Board, an independent executive branch agency created by Congress, may test the willingness of the nation's top judicial body to embrace the robust view of the theory the Trump administration is expected to present. And the 9 judges could be asked to overturn a 90-year-old Supreme Court precedent that limits a president's ability to dismiss certain agencies' heads. Under the Constitution, the U.S. government is divided into the executive, legislature, and judicial branches, set up in the 18th century to ensure checks and balances within the American system. Advocates of the Unitary Executive theory argue that presidents legally can remove any executive branch official, including heads of independent agencies, if such an action would violate, even if such an action would violate job protections enshrined in laws passed by Congress. The doctrine was first popularized 4 decades ago by lawyers in Republican former President Ronald Reagan's administration and may be pushed further during the Trump era. The theory's view of the president's removal power has been embraced gradually in recent decades by the Supreme Court, whose current 6-3 conservative majority includes 3 justices appointed by Trump. But it has yet to endorse actions like Trump's sweeping assertions of executive power since returning to office in January 20. Trump has claimed the power to dismiss the heads of independent agencies, though Congress has restricted such authority. University of North Carolina School of Law professor Michael Gerhardt said, if the court allows Trump to do this or does not interfere with Trump's doing that, it will help to submit the unitary theory of the executive into American constitutional law. Some scholars said Trump's more contentious actions in recent weeks were reminiscent of a view he expressed in 2019 during his first term in office when he said, I have an Article 2, where I have the right to do whatever I want as president. It does seem to me that Trump has gone beyond that classical understanding of unitary executive theory towards something even more extreme. New York University School of Law professor Noah Rosenblum said, witness, for example, his rejection of Congress's power of the purse or his attempt to dissolve an agency that exists as a matter of law. Various plaintiffs have challenged Trump's actions to oust agencies' leaders, undermine federal workforce protections, and dismantle congressionally established agencies such as the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, very controversial, as well as the legality of an entity he created that is led by Elon Musk, dedicated to downsizing the government. Stephen Calabrese, this is the theory gains traction. Stephen Calabrese, a prominent champion of the doctrine, was working as an assistant to the Reagan administration's Attorney General Ed Meese when he became interested in the subject. The theory arose from the widely shared view among Justice Department officials at the time that a law passed establishing a special prosecutor to investigate what was called the Iran-Contra scandal was an unconstitutional intrusion by Congress on presidential powers. So, here we have, this is what would come up, right? How do you deal with a situation like this? When you want to have a Justice Department investigate something that could potentially be going on in the White House or under the direction of the president, you would think you would want that kind of independence, right? So this is there was a law passed establishing a special prosecutor to investigate what was called the Iran-Contra scandal. whether this was an unconstitutional intrusion by Congress on presidential powers. The idea of there being a prosecutor in the executive branch who's independent of the president was contrary to the unitary executive because we thought the Constitution gave all the executive to the president. I mean, that seems to be it. Okay, so how do you in that kind of situation, how do you check the power of the president? Like, how can you investigate the president? Does that have to be done through the legislature? Let's see. His interest in the theory was reinforced by his frustrations with civil servants ignoring orders from Mies to grant asylum to people who fled the Soviet Union or China and faced execution if deported, the sort of bureaucratic resistance, Calabresi said, that Trump now calls the deep state. I remain very much of the view that Article 2 does give the president all of the executive power, and I think the president has the ability to control subordinates in the executive branch who are exercising executive power, said Calabresi, now a law professor at Northwestern University in Illinois. Calabresi added that the core of the unitary executive theory is the president can fire subordinates in the executive branch. But how far does the doctrine go? The core of the theory is the president could fire officers in the executive at will without any restraint from Congress, University of Illinois Chicago professor Stephen Sherwin said. But some advocates pick up on that idea, drew on the logic, and used it to argue for more expansive presidential power in general. A 1935 precedent. Trump's firing of Gwen Wilcox, a Democratic member of the National Labor Relations Board, paralyzed an agency that safeguards the right of American workers. Andrea Katz, a professor at Washington's University School of Law in St. Louis, said that by firing a commissioner whose tenure was protected by a term limit, Trump was essentially breaking a law to trigger a constitutional confrontation. Wilcox has argued in a lawsuit that her removal violates a federal law that allows a president to oust a board member only for neglect of duty or malfeasance in office. Wilcox's lawsuit cited the Supreme Court's 1935 ruling in a case called Humphrey Executor versus United States. That ruling involves a conservative majority Supreme Court restraining the actions of a Democratic president, Franklin Roosevelt. It decided that a president does not have unfettered power to remove commissioners of the U.S. Federal Trade Commission after Roosevelt fired FTC commissioner over policy differences. So this whole thing is like the confusion over who works for who. And who has authority to do what. So the Trump administration has a deadline of this month to file a brief laying out its legal arguments in the Wilcox case. The Trump administration will almost surely defend its removal by asking the Supreme Court to adopt a more muscular version of the unitary executive theory, said Christine Chabot, a professor at the Marquis University School of Law in Wisconsin. The Wilcox dispute, Chabot said, is a perfect test case for the Supreme Court to overrule Humphrey's executor. Trump's actions may push beyond the limits of what the doctrine would allow, according to some scholars. Schwinn, a critic of the doctrine, says that Trump's administration's efforts to close entire agencies are the clearest example of a robust unitary executive theory in practice. Congress has the authority to create these agencies, to grant them power and to fund them, Schwinn said. The president has no authority to dismantle them without explicit authorization from Congress. I mean, that seems right to me. I mean, if the Congress has created some kind of body. Now we have to talk about the legality of that, the non-delegation doctrine and all that, but it does this, funds it, because Congress has the power of the purse. Can the president then decide that, okay, that's not existing anymore? Peter Margulies, a professor at Roger Williams University School of Law in Rhode Island, said that Trump's executive orders double down on the most extreme versions of the unitary executive theory. Margulies pointed to Trump's efforts to fire civil service employees in a manner that seems designed to hollow out the federal workforce. He's going further than most scholars who endorse the unitary executive and much further than the Supreme Court. Rosenblum said Trump also seems to believe he has dispensation power, the power unilaterally to suspend a law. Not even the most aggressive theorists of the unitary executive believe that, Rosenblum said. The dispensation power was a royal power the founders of the countries believed had no place in a republic like the United States. That is Reuters' article here. I think over here, yeah, I was looking at things I brought up, so I went over here to the Constitution. So there we go. All right. Well, I don't know. Did we really figure out what the situation was? I think we have a much greater understanding of the situation, which was my goal here. uh, and I suppose that we end up with it being complicated. Well, I guess it's complicated, which might be a theme often here. At any rate, I thank you very much. I hope this was useful to you. Yeah, I know. I was kind of interested in that too. Should we look at that for just a moment? Let's. I was curious about that too. We've been going for an hour and a half, but I was kind of curious about that too. Let's take a look. Let's see if we can find something on. Uh, it's actually not something I had heard of either. This is probably the way that we are going to be going. Uh, Dispensing power. This is black law that will end up chasing a bunch of different holes. So rabbit holes. So this is dispensing power according to the law dictionary. An agency's authority that excuses a person from doing a duty and asks them to refrain from an act, or from certain conduct. That's not a lot there. This is the Oxford reference here. We've got dispensing power was the prerogative or discretion claimed by the monarch of exempting from the operations of statutes in particular cases. The Long Parliament, in its 19 propositions, accused Charles I of making excessive use of it. James II used it to exempt Catholic army officers from the Test Act. After James had fled in 1688, the Bill of Rights abolishing the suspending power outright. The Bill of Rights abolished the suspending power outright and the dispensing power as it hath been assumed and exercised of late. Merriam-Webster says an authority of a judge or executive or an agent to suspend the operation of a specific statute of rule of law where the interests of justice can be better served by such an action. Where in the interest of justice, or where the interests of justice can be better served by such an action. So yes, I guess we talk more about that. All right. Well, was this useful? I hope it was. I hope it was useful. Like I said, this was kind of an experimental idea, but one that's been in the back of my head for many months. And so I decided, hey, I think I'll just make up all the channel and give it a try. So I hope you have enjoyed it. Thank you to everybody who's been here live with me in the chat. It has been fantastic to have you. Thank you to everybody who might watch later on replay. Please do leave comments down in the chat. What other references do we need? What other things should we look at? I really appreciate your being here, and we will. I think about it. See if we can make this even better. See if it's something to keep going with, and may see you on future episodes. Later, everybody.